Here I am. I am John Atack, and people who watch this channel may have noticed that by now. But this is Gillie Jenkinson. Hi, Gillie.
I
And we met, I've worked this out, we met 10 years ago this coming August, I think it was, in Hendon for the first time.
Was
So
that 10 years ago?
it was 2014.
Wow.
How time passes.
Yeah.
And you and Alex Stain. That's when I
Yeah.
first met Alex as well. So lucky me, really.
Yeah.
And well, tell us a little bit of your backstory first, so that we can
Okay.
get a sense of that.
Well, what I am now is I'm a psychotherapist, I'm an author, and a trainer. And here, product placement behind me. But the reason that I kind of speak about this and I'm involved with this field at all is I was in a cult in the UK back in the 70s, a Bible-based group. I kind of became a born-again Christian at the age of around 18, having grown up in Africa and kind of boarding school and nominal Christianity. You know, obviously the boarding school would say it was a Christian school, and we used to have to go to church, very boring church, I have to say, every Sunday. But at the age of 18, I was approached. Well, I got to know someone who really made a sort of much more charismatic version of Christianity sound very appealing. But she really got her hooks into me, you know, because I was smoking, drinking. I was 18. I was doing what you do at 18, and I wasn't that interested in what she was offering me, but she really kept on and on and on. And I kind of capitulated in the end. And I went from being disinterested to really to being radicalized. I went from sort of one mindset to another very quickly. And I started to work for Christian organizations. I went to church regularly in the week, that sort of thing. And those churches were okay. They weren't cults, but I ended up through a series of circumstances moving to the Midlands as an au pair, which really didn't suit me. And I then moved towns, cities into the cult, and it was a fellowship at the time I joined, but within about probably 3 or 4 months it became a live-in community. It wasn't completely off the rails. My parents were concerned about it, but there wasn't a high level of control. We could go home easily. We could, you know, we shared rooms, but we could do up the room as we wanted. Things were a bit freer.
Yeah.
But just slowly, gradually, the frog kind of in boiling water, you know, it was slowly but surely it started to become more and more controlling until a second leader stepped in. And I've told my story in the book, actually. And things then became much more enclosed, and it became a cult, and it moved into a time of real terror. There were physical beatings for sin. There was real total control. It was a thought reform environment. And I was completely broken by it. I never thought about leaving. And after about 7 years of being a member, maybe after 6 years, things started to loosen up. I don't know why. I don't know how or why the hold started to get a bit looser for some people. And by the end of the 7th year, so we lived in different households. So the main leader lived in his household, and they started to question. I mean, there's a lot of sex going on, sexual abuse, actually. And he thought James Bond was the ideal Christian man, you know, which we all think that, don't we?
Oh, yeah, it's obvious. Now you say it.
Now I say it. So some of the women, because they were all women in his household, started to challenge him, and through that challenge the whole thing literally just split apart very quickly. And I actually went away for a week because I thought, oh, I was still completely under his thrall and his control, but maybe not completely, because I decided to go away to my mother's actually, and I started to kind of break free somewhat mentally. And I left, and I met my husband Tony in the cult, and we kind of were on sides, as you can imagine, a kind of splitting within the membership. There were only about 80, wasn't a huge group, but it was fairly big, and about 6 or 7 community households. So intensely intense. And we decided, I changed sides. Tony was on the other side. He realized the leader was very abusive. So he was on his side, and then I changed sides. Tony and I had been real friends, long story short. But you couldn't go out with someone in the group. They would just separate you. They separated couples. Married couples lived in the men in the men's rooms, women in the women's rooms. I think it's divide and conquer, really.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
Yeah. So, yeah. So we left in 1981 or 1980, and we got married about 4 or 5 months after the community disbanded. And we continued going to church, because the church said they understood about cults. They did not understand about cults. And this is back in the 80s. They especially didn't understand about cults back then.
Yeah.
And so it did us a great disfavor, really, because we sort of stayed in that cult mindset then for 14 more years. So we're talking a very long time of being scared and under this fear of God, and God will send me to hell. And now I see it as ridiculous, but it was a real phobia. And so we were part of a church here in the area we live, and they started to get very controlling. And I think I started to recognize what was happening and decide. I said to Tony one day, I can't go back anymore, because I can't afford to be abused again. I'm not resilient enough. I can't go through that all over again. And so we left, and the leader's wife came and had a walk with me and said to me, Gillie, I fear that Satan has finally got you. And I know, but actually it's so scary at the time.
Of course, it's terrifying if that's what you are most worried about in the world, and somebody you respect is then telling you this is what's happening to you. You now belong to the devil. You know, awful.
I just pushed back, which was probably nearly the first time with them, and just said, look, I've come through so much, thinking back to the cult experience. And then just living with that cult mindset for so many years. And I just pushed back and I said, I don't agree, and I don't think so. This will make you laugh, I also went to see my GP for sort of counselling sessions. She wasn't a counsellor, but she was very kind. And it was way back in the dark ages where GPs actually lived in the village and would actually have time to see you, which really is incredible.
Back in the old days, yeah. Not just a phone call 3 weeks after you try and make an appointment with your doctor, but actually even seeing the same doctor.
Yeah.
Rather than being passed around the rota. Incredible.
Doctor,
old
one
days.
evening a week for a few weeks. And so, in the church, they go on a lot about, unconditional love, and you'll be loved unconditionally forever, blah blah blah. And she said to me, she said, Gillie, you seem to have very sort of all or nothing thinking. And she said, I think you need to get a dog so that you get some unconditional love into your life. So you didn't get it from the people who said they were going to give it to you for the last 30 years. get a dog. So I
Yeah.
did. I got a dog.
So is it a Cat Stevens song
Is it?
about loving his dog more than he loved you? You know,
Oh,
and
really?
but he became a Muslim after that, so
Did
that didn't work for him.
no,
Did the dog work for you, having put that in? Did you feel unconditionally loved, or did you just get a wet face? You know,
no, I felt unconditionally loved,
excellent,
and that was a very long time ago. And like 8 months ago, I adopted another dog who also loves me unconditionally.
splendid.
So yeah, that's it, you know, and it was very, very traumatic. I came
Mm,
out definitely with post-traumatic stress. I didn't
mm,
know what to do with myself, and I got a bit of psychoeducation,
mm,
and that started me on the road of kind of thinking about actually what did happen, and is
mm,
there a way of understanding this and
mm,
explaining it. And it was at that point in 95 when I decided to train as a counsellor, because there
yeah,
were no counsellors who were trained with a code of ethics who could work with former cult members
mm,
back then. There are quite a lot now,
mm,
but so I started on a 30-year journey, just about 30-year journey
mm,
then, did a diploma in pastoral counselling. The reason I did that was I wasn't able to do a secular training at that
mm,
point. I was still too much in the culture of the church, but it was really balanced, and they were fantastic people
mm,
and very different to the experiences. You know, I've met some lovely other people in the
mm,
years were in the ordinary churches, and actually in the cult as well. There was some wonderful people. I haven't had a lot of contact with them, but a lot of people were victimized within that setting. And
mm,
actually, you know, there wasn't a particular problem with them. It's just triggering for them, you know,
mm,
seeing each other. But
of course.
yeah, I did this training, and it was very balanced, very challenging about some of the mad ideas that I'd learned along the way. Like, you do counselling for 3 hours and you pray for people in your counselling sessions. And they were like, no, no, no,
Maybe
no,
not.
teach 3 hours counselling. You'll be half dead by the time you've finished. And
Mm,
well, actually, you know, even in a pastoral counselling setting, they said, no, we don't teach you to pray for people. We think, you know, people should pray for themselves. You know,
mm,
don't need to be doing that powerful action of praying for somebody.
mm.
And
Not
then,
part of the contract. Let me interject that one of the problems is that people become involved in one of the thousands and thousands of different groups, and they get the sense that they are part of a special group, that they're part of an elite. And this can persist for a lifetime after people leave, so that people who've been involved in, you know, the Unification Church, the Moonies, or the Krishnas, or a Christian group, or Jews for Jesus, or Scientology, will cleave to the idea somehow, without really thinking it through, that what happened to them was unique, special, and different. And the reality, as you and I have found through some years of study, is that the mechanics of authoritarian control are the same wherever you go. And so what you've referred to as psychoeducation, which is an expression that worries the hell out of me, because I don't want to be educated in being a psycho, into being a psycho, but psychological education, that understanding just the basics, you know, such ideas as cognitive dissonance or the fundamental attribution error, these wonderful expressions that psychologists come up with, confirmation bias, where we tend to just believe stuff that agrees with us, feelings of knowing, the great William James noesis, this idea that because we believe something, it's true, and that leads to lynch mobs and all sorts of horrors. But not being able to see that there is a broad application of certain techniques, and we are emotionally taken over, so that our critical thinking then serves the stupidity that we believe. So
yeah,
being a reasoning being won't get you out of this. It's how we're emotionally attached. So what you've sought to do, you've done a great deal of learning. You have a doctorate, of which I'm tremendously envious. I have some O levels. Um,
He got O levels,
yeah,
actually.
I got one A level as well when I was at art college, but there you
Yeah.
go.
Yeah.
Salford did tell me they were going to give me a Doctor of Letters, but it's the third year now since that was offered and nothing's happened. So I don't think that's actually true anymore.
I
But
don't know what the Doctor of Letters is.
a D-Lit, it's a recognition by an academic institution that you're quite clever and have done a lot. And having
Yeah.
published sort of 500 articles, 500 videos, a bunch of books, academic
Yeah.
chapters, I think somebody ought to give me, they should call me Your Eminence or Your Grace or Your Worship or something like that. That'd be quite proper. But you have the real stuff. You went and actually studied and got this, and you've produced
Research. It was research based. Yeah.
yeah, and you've produced this marvelous book,
Thank you.
Walking Free from the Trauma of Coercive, Cultic, and Spiritual Abuse. And the reason I say this thing about specialness is this applies to anybody who's been in this situation. Now, it may be that you can get to as you say, that there are more people who understand cultic abuse now than there used to be. But even so, there are hundreds of millions of people, perhaps billions of people who have been through an authoritarian or trapped in an authoritarian experience. The entire population of North Korea, for example. And we see these politically, this is happening in Russia where people, and we see it in all political regimes. It happens in our own regime where there's this attempt through the spin doctors to try and get us to conform to certain authoritarian ideas with which we should not agree, like going out and killing a lot of people, which seems to be the aim of many governments in this world.
Mm.
And so having a better understanding of these things is vital to the future of our society. So there aren't enough people to deal with the hundreds of millions of people who need the help. And so it's vital there should be books such as this book that allow people in the privacy and comfort of their own homes to actually examine the beliefs they've held and move towards beliefs that will be better suited to their future survival and serve their best interests rather than the interests of some fanatical narcissist. So
Yeah.
there's my little speech.
Yes.
I'm interested. There are a couple of concepts which we could dig into those.
Can I say
Yes, go ahead.
because the book's published last May, and
Oh.
it's a long book and it's a workbook, so it's got a lot of worksheets in it. There's a lot of work to do in it to get through to the end. And I had a message on Facebook about 3 days ago from someone saying that they'd been trying for 20 years, I won't say which group, but trying for 20 years to work out what had happened to them. They'd had lots of therapy and etc. And said that they'd just finished working through the whole book and they'd done every single worksheet. And they said for the first time, they felt like they really understood kind of some of the aspect, understood the experience and that it was very liberating. So that's really encouraging for me because, that was the reason it was written. And if it works, because it is an experiment, I've put it out there, but you don't know if it's going to work or if it's going to help. And it is doing. I'm getting some lovely feedback. So, and it won't be for everybody, but that's fine. They don't, it won't suit everyone. Some people do need the therapy work and have a person there, but some want a mixture. Anyway, yeah.
Yeah, and I agree with you that in the time that I've been doing this, which is far too long.
Yeah. Don't want to say.
It's 4 decades. I left Scientology in 1983.
Yeah.
And it's been difficult at times. There was a lot of harassment involved.
Yeah.
And some quite angry people. It's a bit strange when you look out of your window and on the pavement there are people marching up and down with placards attacking you.
Absolutely.
And being followed by private detectives and having horrific rumors spread, published and spread, all sorts of good fun. It's been quite difficult at times, and not having any money. There's no financial support for this.
No.
That I've been able to find yet. And I'm retired now, theoretically, and yet here I am
Oh,
doing this. But the reward is exactly that, that every now and then somebody will say, what you did helped
yeah.
me. It changed. I was able to change my life because of, when we met or something you said. And that's a very important aspect, and it keeps us going. And so for people out
Even
there, please send us Christmas cards, at
yeah.
least. Yeah. So in the book, you have a couple of concepts. I have a real problem, always have, in getting a new word into my head.
Mm.
And we have there's a word here which I'd like you to talk about, because you used it in a special sense, and that is the word confluence.
Yes.
So could you tell us a bit about confluence, or
Yeah, confluence. So one of my masters, so I did a master's after the diploma in pastoral counselling. I did a master's in Gestalt psychotherapy, which has some interesting history to it. But the actual theories of it, some of them are very useful. And so I was really glad that I studied it, and I found the idea of introjects and confluence, particularly, were two words that came through from the Gestalt psychotherapy theory. And the idea of confluence is the idea of merging. So other writers will talk about being merged, or, being kind of almost swallowed up by the group. One's sense of individuality is lost, and you're just sort of swallowed up into it. And it's simply that, really. And there's quite a few diagrams to try and explain, so for me, when I was actually in the cult, I was almost completely confluent. I had very little left of my, what I call my authentic identity. Look, it's really hard to find words to, to describe all these different things. But I try.
And you start, and the problem in a group is that you'll start using the language as a group to define yourself, without necessarily understanding what the language of the group means.
Exactly.
And confluence itself means flowing together.
Yeah.
So as you say, and it's a very important concept, that your individuality, your identity, is now merged.
Yes.
And where there are natural ways in which that occurs, so there's a confluence with your family, there's a confluence with your friends. In this case, it's an unwarranted confluence. It's where you are being dominated within the relationship.
And you can't move, you don't have the choice to move away. So, in a healthy marriage, or, relationship, or with friends, we meet, or we have contact, or we become somewhat confluent, but we move away. We're not, we come back to ourselves, who our authentic identity. But within that cultic setting, we're just swallowed up, and it's to different degrees. And in the book, there's an exercise, page 85, which is just trying to help somebody. Well, it's becoming progressively more confluent. It's kind of a head shape, which was the shape I used for the member. That was how, yes, that one. Yes, so you've got that sort of sense of progression, of becoming more and more confluent.
It's rather like a Venn diagram where you have two circles overlapping, and in a healthy relationship, there's a part of you that's outside of the overlap, the confluent part. In a very unhealthy relationship, you are a slave. You're subservient to the ideas.
Outside, exactly. So I used to use that up until the book. When I worked with a graphic designer, I used circles, and she said, why don't we use this head shape? That's because, she knows what she's doing, and I don't.
That's my excuse too.
Yeah. I mean, it's the same thing in the end. It's just a bit more interesting with the head shape, which is repeated throughout in different settings, in different milestones, they're called, the chapters.
And I think the use of the human head to humanize it is
Yeah,
is sensible. It's a good idea. So,
yeah,
do
yeah. I
pass
thought it.
that on to your graphic artist from me
Oh, I
if and
have.
when
I
you ever.
thanked her enormously. But on page 88, there's a picture. This was me, which is the circle with which is the cult spiritually abusive setting, and nearly almost completely swallowed up. Yes, so you get there's a tiny bit of me, and in
Mm,
actual fact, I think that's even overstating it in itself. I never thought about leaving. That's something I
mm,
find quite interesting. When I've worked with hundreds of former members,
mm.
and very often they have some level of doubts or something.
Yeah,
I
the
want to leave,
the
or
red flags. Yeah.
yeah, red flags, whatever. I got completely lost to myself, and that's just what happened to me. And it took quite a lot of effort when it was the group was splitting up for me to actually go away for that week and to think, actually, I need to think for myself, how am I going to break free of this?
Mm,
And then it's been quite a journey since then.
mm. And
So,
my experience was, and what you say is absolutely true. There's a degree of involvement, and it's variable.
yeah.
So I was very lucky because although I was in Scientology is probably the most elaborate thought reform system ever devised. It has at least 2,000 techniques which are in active use, whereas, say, transcendental meditation has two. Um, they are hypnotic techniques. They are guided use of guided imagination, and at the extreme. And I'm with the Aftermath Foundation now, helping people to leave Scientology, and most of the other board members were executives within Scientology, and their lives were completely subsumed. The stories I've heard over the last 40 years of people who were enslaved physically and psychologically. They worked a 90-hour week. They were not allowed to see their children, and more recently, not allowed to have children. Their diet was terrible. I remember talking to one woman who told me that it was routine for her to have 2 hours sleep a night, which is not enough to maintain the human body.
No, it's dangerous. It's unhealthy. It's not right, and it's inhuman. Yeah.
Yeah, and people will come away from that experience. It's incredible, the resilience, really. But I'm a fan of George Bonanno's work on resilience, who basically says most people, given enough time, will come through. I mean, there are studies of Auschwitz survivors that said that on a 25-year follow-up, most of them were living lives. It had come back. But that doesn't mean that there's anything wrong with somebody who's still having to try and cope with this. Those people have been lucky enough to have the life around them allow them to heal. I've met people who decades later were still completely crushed by their experience, decades after leaving. I was very lucky because I was never a live-in member. And so when I started to see, I can only call it the fascism of Scientology, as an anti-democratic organization. There was bullying. We were being told that we had to stop talking to certain people because they were suppressive. And I had no difficulty in saying, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to follow those rules.
Good for you.
Well, probably more by luck than judgment, because I know many highly intelligent, highly educated people, very strong people, who were then tethered by the group. And I use the term weaponized empath, that they're often very good people who were then used to hurt others and to control others. So
Good
the,
term.
the degree of involvement, and as you say, this often leads to complex post-traumatic stress disorder, which we have to differentiate from combat post-traumatic stress disorder.
Yeah.
And we get into a very difficult area there, because PTSD has where major depressive illness has 277 combinations of symptoms possible. PTSD is listed with 1,000 possible combinations. So we are dealing with an amorphous creature here, but it's enough to say that something can disable your locus of control. It can take away your sense of control. And that's what Judith Herman put forward as complex PTSD.
Yes.
And then you have to go through recovery, and that recovery can happen naturally. But what you are seeking to do, and what I've sought to do, is to accelerate that recovery.
Yes.
I mean, my work has moved more and more towards prevention and trying to get people to recognize problems, and it is horrifying. I mean, I say I had a guy who was 20 years housebound because Ron Hubbard had told him he was a suppressive person and he didn't want to hurt anybody. So he'd locked himself away. It took one afternoon to deal with that. And it was one of the few occasions when I was furious that this thought that somebody had been forced to suffer this because he was a good person, because he was a helpful person. And it was great a week later when he was like, I've got a job, I'm come back to life. But realizing how many people it is such a long struggle. And I think that your book will be very helpful to people in that situation and should accelerate their recovery.
I hope so. It's certainly true for some people, and that's the intention. It's a lot of hard work, and that was the intention.
The other word, as you say, that comes from Gestalt therapy, not from Gestalt psychology, a different thing, is the word introject. So tell us about this lovely word.
So an introject is something, a belief or behavior that you swallow whole, you take into your system without chewing it over. So it's sort of, you're kind of talking about the teeth, you're talking about the digestive system. And one of the things that did make me laugh when I first heard it was that Gestalt psychotherapy was a pushback against Freudian psychoanalysis.
Which needed to happen.
Beg your pardon?
There needed to be a pushback. I think Freud was a dreadful, awful person, and the whole system is absolutely bizarre, with the exception of Dan Shaw, who's a lovely man. But he's a forensic analyst, which is different from a Freudian analyst.
I mean, it's evolved these days. I mean, it's a different animal these days, but back then, this was in the 50s, it did need some pushback. And Fritz Perls, who was also a problematic character, I will say that, but I won't get into it here. But
and a fan of L. Ron Hubbard, of course, which is not a good thing.
That's even worse. And I know I won't go into that, but
no point.
Sort of extrapolating some theories that were helpful or that could be used to be helpful. He thought that human development was kind of based on the teeth rather than, this is what I thought, teeth, well, that sounds ridiculous, rather than, ego and blah, 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 which I could never get my head around, all that ego stuff from a Freudian perspective, not a cult.
But you could get your teeth into the idea of teeth, eh?
I could get my teeth eventually. And but the idea that the newborn baby is born without teeth, it's drinking pre-digested food, it doesn't have the wherewithal to chew things over or to go, it's just totally reliant on caregivers or it will die. Then you've got the toddler who gets the toddler teeth, the early teeth, and
milk teeth.
Milk, thank you, that's the word, milk teeth. And they start to kind of, do I like it? I can chew a bit more. And then they fall out, and then you get the adult teeth. And theoretically, and in a healthy situation, you can choose what you eat. You can decide what you like, what you don't like, what you're going to swallow and take in, but you need to chew it over. And this idea, it's almost a regression, I suppose, although I haven't used the theory in terms of regression. It's a simple idea. Like the pictures in my book are like, there's a whole load of pictures in the book, and like on the front cover, and they're like cartoons. And that's how I try to really bring things down to a very simple idea. It's not a complex idea. Yeah. It may have complexities to it, but I try and make it as simple as possible, and that within the cult we swallow whole. So within my Bible-based group, we'd be exposed to the sermons every week, and you literally take it in and you swallow it whole, and it just sits in your belly. And it's not digesting properly, it's not nourishing you, and you can't poo it out either. It's just stuck in your system and it causes pain. So an introject can be, I'm sinful, literally I'm sinful, which within that setting is a very serious thing. I mean, it's the most serious thing there is. You've got to work very hard not to be sinful. So, or I'm selfish, or you could put in Scientology words or unification words or whatever. I'm have Cain thoughts for the Unification Church. So you actually and it's a very simple idea that works very well actually in the therapy, is that actually let's identify the introjects, the things that are still sitting in your system that you swallowed whole, you couldn't push back on, you couldn't say what a load of bollocks, because actually you would have gotten into trouble, big trouble. And so there's another layer to this, which I've tried to just gently explain, but I think that we develop a cult identity. I've called it a pseudo identity, using Paul Martin's words.
Or Jolly West, of course.
Yes, Paul Martin and Jolyon West, exactly. And just this idea that in order to be a member of the group, whether you're born and raised or whether you're a first generation, in order to be a member of that group, you have to do what you're told. You have
swallow it whole.
Exactly, you have to swallow it whole, and it starts to change your identity or your personality. I've tried to use the same terminology, and I decided to call it identity, and I can explain why if you really want to know. But and I fully acknowledge that there's thousands of writers who've tried very hard to work out what is our identity, what's our personality, what is self, blah, blah, blah. But I've tried to reduce it to using the language consistently and trying to explain that, or explaining that, and then keeping it within that consistency. It's not to say there aren't other ways of looking at it. It's simply to say, I'm hoping this is a helpful way of looking at it. So as we undo the introjects, we start to unlayer the pseudo identity, like you're a lazy woman, or women don't matter, or women shouldn't be in leadership, or women should be doing the washing up and nothing else. And these things are really introjected within a cultic setting, including within mine. And so that starts to mold you, and it started to mold me into a particular mindset of what a woman was. And so those are introjects. So I found it very helpful to say, actually, that's not true, and it's not going to be true for me, and it's certainly not what other people, there are many people who push back on those thoughts within society or within those cultic settings. And so I think people have found the idea of introjects particularly very helpful. And there's a whole chapter on introjects, and then phobias, because this was Steve Hassan's thoughts, that cults induce phobias. And I thought that was such a help, literally install phobias. So I had a phobia about hell, and it was holding me in the group, but actually it was an introject and a load of bollocks. It wasn't true. It was their way of controlling me and keeping me in. And so being able to kind of look at that. So there's a bit on phobias. What is a phobia? How to chew over the phobia, how to disarm it. And then there's a section in that same chapter on critical thinking and actually, okay, let's look at this from a critical, and I used Amy Baker's, it's very simple, very, very simple. It's not, well, I hope it's simple, you know, because I like things that are made simple. I remember doing my PhD and using all these big words, and my supervisor was like, why are you writing it like this? And I said, I thought that's what I had to do.
I wanted to sound clever. We meant to sound clever.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Whereas
I think often things, you know, I think we should reduce things. Often the clever terms, like all of the Latinate terms for parts of the body, it's like there's your front arm muscle and your back arm muscle, biceps, triceps, triceratops, you know, that things sound so fancy, you know, if you call something a dinosaur or terrible lizard, it sounds really quite clever. But it is a matter of that the concepts themselves are often more simple than that. Injects, it touches on Aaron Beck's idea of self-instruction, that there are certain things that we're saying so rapidly to ourselves, certain beliefs. So when somebody, you know, knocks a glass off a table and they go, I'm always doing that. I'm so clumsy. And understanding that what's happened, I suppose, in Freudian terms is the superego. There's an external instruction and you are following that as if it was a rule. Now, I would take that very quickly to Eric Fromm, very quickly, and his idea of the pseudo-self, and his idea that, in fact, about 60% of people never mature, never develop a self, because they're always looking to these introjects. They're always looking to these instructions that come from the outside. How am I meant to behave? What am I meant to look like?
so I followed it whole and it's affecting me. So
yeah, and so developing a self is not, I mean, you know, children have to do that. You're not born with it. And we have a society that through advertising and politics and religion discourages thinking, you know, and good politics, good religion encourage chewing it over, you know, getting it so that you can digest it and coming to your own decisions rather than having this festering mess of nonsense inside us that is brought about through phobia, through guilt, and through aversion, through disgust, through the rousing of disgust towards the other.
Yeah. Festering mess of nonsense is a great term.
Yes, I've been working on that one since we started this conversation almost for several minutes.
It's so right. You know, the whole hell business, the whole kind of, you know, what I left with what I left the group with, my sense of myself, which I still can't believe I've even got to where I've got to, you know, sometimes, because I was absolutely downtrodden and you wouldn't have known. I didn't know, and Tony didn't know. He said to me once, quite a long time ago, he said, who knew? Because he didn't know me before. So what he knew was my identity. He knew this downtrodden woman. And then I found, actually, I'm a lot more creative. There's a lot more in me that I wanted to do and that I did. I wanted to do the PhD. I did not know I could do it. I mean, we were joking a bit about O levels and A levels. I did not do well at school. And I want to say to anyone, it's never too late. You know, I was 61 when I got my PhD, 62 even. And I just knew I needed to do it. You know, I kind of followed my gut instinct. I was lucky because I was able to do it. I was working at Sheffield Rape Crisis at the time, and I was able to fund it through that counselling work, and Tony was supporting in other ways. So, but I've just followed my gut instinct all the way through of kind of, you know, what do I need to do? And all of that sort of come together in Walking Free and in the book, and just pulled the whole thing together and started writing it in lockdown, actually, as we went into lockdown. So yeah,
Great.
quite amazing, really.
So I think probably we can round things up at this point.
Okay.
That do rush out and buy several copies of the book.
Thank you.
Give them to your friends, and be in touch with Gillie through Facebook to record your progress, because this in and of itself, as you said earlier, it's an experiment. It's an experiment based on a great deal of study and work on your part. You know, a few years ago, somebody came to me with a book that was recommending to therapists how they should treat cult members. And the unfortunate thing was that the author of the book had never treated a cult member. And so this cannot be done hypothetically. So this is based upon actual research and encounter with hundreds of former members.
Two lots, masters and PhD.
So, yeah. And is of itself, therefore, the beginning of more research to understand how we can refine these ideas and make them more useful. So thank you very much, Gillie. And
thank you.
We'll talk again in the nearness of time.
Yeah. You take care.
You too. Thanks.
Bye.
Hi, John here. Thanks for watching. We'd appreciate it very much if you would click like, as well as subscribe, and click the bell for notifications. Every dollar helps, and we welcome new patrons on Patreon, or you can make a one-off payment with any currency through PayPal. Thanks so much. I wanted to sound clever. We meant to sound clever.
Exactly.